Welcome back, everyone. We're going to shake things up a little bit and do kind of a Huntley-Brinkley here. It's my real pleasure to introduce Dr. Sam Muller. He's the founding director of the Hague Institute for Innovation of Law, which, as Jim Silkenak noted, is a new name, which I think it's inappropriate to show the shift in emphasis to innovation from its old name, and I'll let Sam explain that to you. Sam's an international lawyer by training. Sam works on justice strategy and innovation, really at the highest political levels. Before his work at HiiL, he was closely involved in building the International Criminal Court. He worked as a legal advisor for the UN in the West Bank and Gaza, and then the newly established ICTY. He holds a law degree and doctorate from Leiden University in Holland, and he has taught there. One of the reasons why we have Sam here as closing things out is Sam also served as a senior advisor to the Task Force on Justice that published the groundbreaking report that we've made reference to on people-centered justice in July 2019. He's been also very active at the World Economic Forum on issues of rule of law and justice, chairing 2 of the agenda councils at the World Economic Forum. And in November 2022, he was awarded the 2022 Thalberg SNS Eliasson Global Leadership Award, quote, for his innovative work in creating and implementing new concrete concepts and ways of working for law practitioners that focus on solving people's real needs and thereby reinforce their commitment to democracy. So I think Sam I view him as one of the founding fathers of people-centered justice for his work on that groundbreaking report in 2019. And I thought I would just open it up, Sam, by asking you to give us an insider's view of how that what I think is a revolutionary report came to pass.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. First of all, it's really annoying because we've worked very, very hard, and our tagline was HiiL, user-friendly justice. And then came this international thing, and they started using people-centered justice, and it basically killed that tagline. We had to go back to the drawing board on that. I suppose the justice or the task force on justice was something that was waiting to happen, although at the time, of course, we didn't know. There was a group, the World Justice Project, with whom we were already working closely, and it was so clear, it is so clear, still is, that the justice gap is absolutely huge. We'd had the Commission on Legal Empowerment, which had already done something, which had already made the point how important legal empowerment is, but it wasn't really moving forward. Yeah, with the help of the Pathfinders, who were, and I think every field needs that every now and then. You need a small neutral place where everybody could be better than him or herself and who could bring us together. Because I did find that, even in our world of justice improvers, we're all fighting for donor money, we're all fighting for our little position, we all have our little thing. And the Pathfinder Secretariat was a really good place where we could rise above our own shadows and come together in a neutral place, well facilitated, and say, okay, look, let's sit and look at what the problem is, which is what then happened. The task force came, there were a number of reports on innovation and stuff like that. And with that, we were able to pronounce this idea of people-centered justice, put it out there. And since then, it's really been built on. And being at the Summit of Democracy, in March, and seeing Samantha Power say, USAID, we're going to do people-centered justice, was a pretty amazing thing. And I think the great thing about the people-centered justice movement is nobody owns it. It's really ours. to make it work. So we're in a good place. And I think where we are now is that people-centered justice has gone from what is it, of course, because that was the big first question. You know, people-centered justice, great. What is it? I was really fortunate to be asked to facilitate the ministerial meeting that came with the Hague Declaration on Access to Justice. So that already had brought some criteria, some structure into what it is. But I suppose we're still learning. But I think where we are now is a good place, and that's why this conference is also so important. We've really gone from what is it to let's do it. But we need and now learn to do it. That's I think where we are. And maybe just instead of data, a little story. You know, of how bad it is and how we should look at ourselves, I think, as a profession. My son, he did a bachelor's in law about 2 years ago. And I kind of followed him, just to be fair. He did it in a year. Well, he's a smart guy, and he had done some stuff. So he was able to do it in a year, and I followed him that year. And to my shock and amazement, he was learning more or less the same stuff that I learned 30 years ago. I mean, different cases, different laws, but the fundamentals were the same. And it's interesting, because this happened in parallel, my wife is a doctor, when my niece was doing her medical degree. And I tell you, my wife understands about 30% of what my niece is learning. I understand about 100% what my son is learning. That tells you a little bit about our profession and where we are and where our system, you know, needs to undergo a pretty fundamental change.
That is quite a vignette. With your permission, I might repeat it. I'll attribute authorship to you, though, in the future. So this is sort of an open-ended two-part question. I saw you taking copious notes today, but thinking back on all the material that we covered today, the first question is, what resonated the most with you? And I guess the second is, what new questions might it have raised for you?
Or maybe a few things. One thing that I think is very important to say is that we heard a lot about, you know, access to justice, and I frankly came to, you know, I don't like the word access to justice, because access to justice is often related to the poor who need to be helped. But actually, in my country, my wife, again, who has a 3-man, small little GP practice, when she needs the justice system, it isn't there for her either. It's too expensive, it takes too long, she doesn't understand it, it makes her life crazy, and she just had an employment dispute, so I followed that quite closely. It's not just the poor, it is the vulnerable and the poor, but we're looking at a much bigger problem. And that's, I think, one important thing to say. What I also noticed is that there's almost two different worlds that are out there. So there's, on the one hand, a justice system that is constantly struggling to deal with cases and decisions. I must not have a backlog. I don't know how many judges I've talked to and judges leaders, you know, fighting the backlog every single day. Cases and decisions. And I almost, you know, sometimes jokingly say, you're a cases and decision machine. And that's what you need to produce. Versus, on the other hand, a population and an increasing group of justice practitioners who have a wider view and say, look, it's not about cases and decisions, it's about, what I would then call, you know, prevention and resolution rates. How many justice problems, how many legal problems have we been able to prevent? And the ones that arose, you know, how were we able to resolve them? A bit like in the health sector, you know, how many diseases were we able to prevent and how many did we cure? And when I said something like this, maybe 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, people thought, you know, you've got to be crazy. The justice system is about decisions. And I now really see that changing. And what I heard today, you know, a lot of the conversations were about resolution and about prevention. So I think that's really important. The second thing that I would say that I observed, I see it in our work, and I saw it again today. You know, one of the teasing questions I like to ask ministers of justice when I talk to them is, who in your country is the minister for the prevention of justice problems? And of course, there's no answer, because that is, nobody owns that. The Minister of Justice is only responsible to make sure that once it happens, and I can't remember, one of the panel members said, you know, once it reaches the judges, it's too late, she said. And that's when you need to adjudicate, and it's really tough. That's a key issue we need to solve, and maybe we can talk about that a little more. Who owns the constant improvement of prevention and resolution rates in a country? We haven't really answered that. And I mean, of course, giving that some thought, and maybe I can share, you know, a couple of things with you, not because I think I have worked it out and because I have the truth, but that could be something to talk about, because we've got to look a couple of really tough issues and difficult questions about ourselves, I think, as lawyers in the eye, if we're to solve this immense justice gap. And, you know, just to, I was just looking up some numbers, but the US has, was it 250 million legal problems annually? Kenya, 7 million annually. Nigeria, 25 million annually. Tunisia, 5 million. Germany, 110 million every 2 years. And I could go on. I mean, so it's pretty big. So why are we not able as a system to change? And let me just throw them at you. The first is what I call confusion over the why and the what. You all know CNEC and this great thing, Start with the Why, this great management book. So I think there is confusion at best, and maybe even, you know, rivalry at worst, about why we have justice systems. And the dichotomy, or maybe on the scale, there's on the one hand people who say, you know, justice systems are there only for the worst things, the worst cases, to adjudicate the absolute worst things. And I've heard many civil servants, many justice leaders say to me, we should not make it too attractive to go to courts. So you know, that's just the way it is, and that's what justice systems are for. And then there is another vision, which you could read, I really like it, in the Justice Strategy of Scotland, where they actually have a phrase that says, people must have trust and confidence that justice will be delivered in respect of all issues which impact their lives. That's a completely different vision. And when you look at the strategy, it's an extremely people-centered vision that connects the justice system with a lot of other government agencies that people need and whatever. And if you're not aligned on the why you have a justice system, then the what, namely what you produce, will be different.
Absolutely.
So that's just one thing, and I see that a lot. The second thing I would mention is compartmentalization. You know, for a lot of good reasons, the justice sector has a lot of Chinese walls built into it. I need to not get into them. Judges don't talk to prosecutors, ministries, parliaments, and so forth, and so forth. And they're very important, but they make managing the system really hard, and actually probably harder in the health sector and the education sector where you don't have that. And these Chinese walls make sense, but they're also a big impediment. And then connected with that is a third issue, which is ownership. As I said, who owns conflict prevention and resolution in a country? That's not entirely clear. And I remember a conversation with a good friend of mine who's a former Minister of Justice. He said, I was the captain of a ship, but I didn't have much control over the rudder and the engine. At the same time, I could be fired for everything, which is kind of true. And I've done some internet search, but the Minister of Justice is one of the most frequently fired ministers in the cabinet, you know? So ownership is tough. And again, who owns it? And we've seen, and we've heard today, you know, many different, you know, from individual ownership, many different agencies, institutions, and how do you organize that? And I think that's something we need to sort out. if you want to go towards higher prevention and resolution rates, you need to have some kind of ownership. And it doesn't have to be one person. There's a lot of interesting literature about, task forces doing this. We've referenced in some of our work, the work of Mariana Mazzucato, who talks about the mission approach, whatever, but you have to have some degree of ownership. And then there's the fourth issue, which I call the voice, which is, do the users have a voice? We've heard that a lot. The system always talks, about improving the system from the perspective of the system, by the system. I could go on, but there's really no voice. And that's also different from the medical sector, where, if in Holland, the people who die of cancer or diabetes, if that goes up or treatments are worse, there's all kinds of associations of patients who kick the system or left, right, and center. But there's no such thing. Really, there's no, an association of divorce people who keep, the family justice people on their toes. So there's an issue with the voice, and we talked about data as an issue, and also just engagement. How do you engage with that? Then the fifth issue, I would say, that I find one of the most challenging is what I call the marketplace. So actually, the legal services market, if you define it broadly, and let me use an American term for that, it sucks. It's pretty dysfunctional. It's very monopolistic. There's no accountability for outcomes. There's very little data. There's very little incentive to innovate. I've talked to a lot of impact investors who invest a lot, and they say, oh, no, I'm not going to touch the legal sector. There's too much trouble connected with it. There's all kinds of rules and whatever. I'm not going to do that. Funding isn't all that well organized. So how can we? Gillian Hadfield is one of the scholars who's written really good stuff about that. We need to change that marketplace to make it interesting for impact investors, to make it more accountable. In Holland, the National Accountancy Office has, I happen to know its previous chair. He's despondent. He says, look, the justice budget is the only budget without outcomes. And I keep saying it as head of, but Parliament keeps allowing it to just continue, and it's not really changing. So working on redesigning this marketplace, I think, is a critical thing we all need to do, and that's going to hurt because there will be winners and losers. I've talked to a lot of people from the bigger law firms will be fine, but the smaller law firms, for example, may lose. At the same time, with innovation, they can also win. 7 million Kenyans, 7 million legal problems a year in Kenya, with an official justice system that could deal with only about 500,000 a year. That's a big market. I was telling the Kenya Law Society. So let's open it up. Then there are a few other things I would mention. One is culture. It's just that our culture as lawyers is very conservative. Richard Susskind has written some great stuff about that. One, how we love incremental change based on precedent. And he also has a wonderful description about how we turn it around. We can take a precedent of a specific case in 1750 and turn it into a rule in 2022 with great brilliance. But it isn't really innovative. We're not used to, and we don't get taught that in law school, I think, generally. I mean, there's great examples and it's improving, but it's not there. Politics, I note, is a big issue. Catching bad people is good for votes, but being good at increasing prevention and resolution rates is not so good for votes. So there's something there that we need to overcome, how we tell the story. And also within politics, short-termism. I mean, it takes I'm a close friend with Chief Justice Willie Mutunga when he started building the Kenya justice system after the new constitution in 2010. And he said, any young lawyer I recruit now will only be fully operational 6 or 7 years down the road. And so he was constantly thinking at least 8 years. And that's not generally how our politics work. And the last difficult one to confront, I call it stuckness. I don't think it's an English word, but what do I mean with stuckness? That is that there's so many really good, people in the system that are trying to change it, and they'll say, I know the system doesn't work, but how can I fix a plane while it's flying? And that's the problem, which I think we need probably change managers and people like that who could help us with that. But if you're a Minister of Justice or a Chief Justice and you really want to change things, what do you need to do? One, you need to keep the mediocre system that you have now running, because you can't stop that. And everybody is overworked and underfunded in that system. So that's really tough. You need to keep that going. Then you need to free out a couple of people like Matt and whatever, and say, okay, I'll give you 25% of your time to start thinking of new things. I don't know, to collect data, to start working on innovation, to do research, whatever you need. But there's no money for that. And then when the Matts have come up with great stuff, you then need to somehow integrate that back into the system while it is running. This is a really tough thing to do. And I think we need to look outside our system as lawyers to figure out, and there must be examples where things like this have been done. Running a system, renewing a system, and then integrating the new stuff into the system as you go. We really haven't figured that out. So those are the kind of the 8 difficult things that I think we need if we really want to transform the system, which we have to do. But I don't proclaim the truth, so I'd be very interested to hear any reactions to this.
Thanks so much, Sam. Those are very insightful comments. And let me do a follow-up immediately for you, because you're for, obviously, for innovation. And I'm familiar with some of your work, and you've hosted, challenges, contests for innovation. And I'm sure there's been some fantastic ideas you've collected. One of the things I think you mentioned, I know Swati mentioned it, and I think Judge McEwen mentioned it, is can you share some thoughts on when you do this? Because a lot of us who are doing international development work know we're actually doing a lot of pilot projects, but you hit a winner. How do you bring that to scale? What are some of the things that you think about when you think about converting good, promising initial results to a nationwide program?
Well, that is a tough one. So I think the 8 things I mentioned have something to do with it.
Yeah.
At HiiL, we've started to define people-centered justice as we kind of internally sometimes call it the 5 petals, the 5 things you kind of need to have in order for it to work. First, data. So data about the needs and experiences of people, so you know where the problems are, and in business terms, you know where the market is, and what problem you need to solve. The second element that we've now really made part of also our accelerator program is evidence-based practice. So, let's work a little less on the basis of great legal theory, but let's work on the basis of what we know works. What works to keep a family together in a complex divorce procedure in a rural environment in Kenya? What best practices do we have, and can we continuously test them? And only work on the basis of those best practices, and also share those best practices. I had a conversation with Tim just right now when he was saying what he was learning in Somalia. We've got a program in Niger. So, what can we learn from what you're doing? So creating capacity within the Ministry of Justice, within the judiciary, within a bar association to collect best practices and to put them in, the equivalent, I guess, in the medical sector of protocols that everybody can access, could use for what you're doing. And then the 4th element, and that's the innovation element, that's where the scale comes in, you then have to answer the question, how can we get those best practices to as many people as possible who need it, when they need it, against a sustainable funding model. And that's innovation around delivery models. And right now, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the two delivery models we have are both from 1850, namely a law firm and a court. And yeah, the world has moved on since then. So let's see if we can come up with other delivery models. And we've heard quite a lot, of examples of other delivery models, but making them scale is difficult. And we've learned with our Justice Accelerator that there are a lot of good ideas out there, but as I said, that there is a graveyard of pilots, or there is a certain level at which, beyond which it is very hard for these innovators to scale. And one of the reasons for that is the dysfunctional marketplace. I hate to say it. So we've added a fourth element to our people-centered justice programming, and it's what we call creating an enabling environment. We've kind of worked out by now, in which areas, and community justice courts is one example of what we call a game changer. We've researched it really well, and we know these things work in many different countries in many different ways. We don't need to invent a lot of new stuff, but if we could help the community justice initiatives in the different countries that are out there go from where they are now, maybe functioning on a scale from 1 to 10, out of 5 or a 6, and we can help them to an 8 or a 9, we've got a lot of impact. But then you need to work on the enabling environment. And the enabling environment means, the political support for it. It means creating new funding models or funding mechanisms for this to happen. There is zero investment in the justice sector. It depends a lot on do-goods. And if you don't have a do-good culture in your country, on donors, and donors decide what they want and don't decide what you need. So, there's a lot of complexity there. Funding models, I think regulation of, as I said, a regulatory model for this new market. The ability to conclude PPPs, one of the things I hear a lot from justice ministries, they're not allowed to conclude PPPs, which, in the health sector and the education sector, all innovation at scale has happened through public-private partnerships. And there's absolutely no reason. And there's some good examples, by the way, in the UAE. They've got some really great examples of where the ministry, there it is possible, has partnered up with big software houses and whatnot, and has really been able to do great stuff. So we always have a separate element, a separate team that works on enabling environment, that brings justice leaders together at different levels and really tries to work out, how can we create the environment? Because, the data is critical, the best practices are critical, but you're never going to really scale the innovations and the new delivery models if you don't deal with the enabling environment.
So data is at the center of people-centered justice, and I would welcome your thoughts, and I have my own experiences with this and trying to get justice sector data with program design. And I'll just share one anecdote, and then I'll turn it over to you, Sam. So we're having, I remember, I think I was at the State Department INL Bureau at the time, and we're having this big discussion with UNODC in Vienna. And they had this big study, and they were sure they were going to get data. They had this framework for how they were going to get justice data. And I remember in the course of the call, they said, and we're going to test it in Bosnia. And I said, boy, this is going to be interesting. And some time went by, and they came back, and it was almost a sheepish conversation because they walked around and there was no clear structure to the data. And this is not a question of electronic storage. This is just paper files, consistent filing systems, et cetera. So they spent a good bit of time and then just sort of said, we don't know. And so when we think about data being at the center of people-centered justice, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, because there's, the data that the courts are collecting, the prosecutors are collecting, and then there's what is the legislature looking at when they're making decisions to create more, maybe, projects at scale or an enabling environment. I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts about this data problem.
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. And there's a lot of skills and Charybdis you kind of need to navigate between. I mean, you can collect a lot of data, and I remember earlier this year, I was in Kenya, and the Chief Justice of Kenya, Judiciary of Kenya, has an amazing data team, and you can call some of those, people in that team. You can call them up at 4 a.m. and ask me how many people are in prison now, and they will tell you, and it'll be correct. But of course, you need to have data that is actionable and that helps you then make strategies and determine whether you go left or right. And that's more difficult. And in my mind, more and more, I'm starting to connect that with the first question I asked, is the why of the justice system and the what. I mean, you collect data for the why. And the example I like to use, which a conversation with a management consultant, but he told me a while ago about a mission statement that Volvo had. And I may not have the year completely accurate, but it was something like, by 2030, nobody will die in a Volvo. And I thought that was just amazing in its simplicity. And it just means that everybody in the supply chain of making a Volvo is constantly geared towards that. It's got to be safe, it's got to be safe, it's got to be safe, it's got to be safe. If I need to make a difficult choice between, what kind of innovation, whether I spend money or whatever, that's our mission statement. Nobody dies in a Volvo. And so what's the, could we come up with an equivalent like that? And, one of my dreams is that one day, justice systems will have a similar mission statement, which will say, we will increase the resolution rates of the 5 most prevalent problems from 40% to 60% in the next 4 years. And, that's measurable, that's doable. And then, if that's your mission statement, instead of saying, we'll reduce the backlog, when you've reduced the backlog, you still don't know whether you've produced more prevention or resolution. You may have reduced the backlog, but you may have also seriously pissed off a lot of people that are really angry and feel they've been unjustly treated. So if you have something like that at the pinnacle, then your data collection is a function of that. You want data that helps you understand that. And you go from such a high level, let's reduce the resolution rates with 60%. And it could also be very specific. Let's reduce, and this is what we try and do in all our, the stakeholder dialogues that we have. We basically bring justice leaders from different parts of the system together, from judiciary, Ministry of Justice, innovators, lawyers, bar associations, civil society, usually, for conversations of 3 days each, which last a period of about half a year, and we give them the data from their country, and we say, can you formulate outcome-based goals based on that? And then once you have that, the outcome-based goals, then you can make it, I think it's then much easier to work with data. And last thing about data, it's also a culture. When you work on the basis of data and best practice, and the data is telling you that something is not working, first of all, you need to learn fast, and you need to want to know fast if something is not working. So no delays, no bureaucratic nonsense. You need to really want to know fast, because remember, you're always thinking about your mission statement. And secondly, if it's not working, the system has to have a discipline, because if it's not working, there's only 2 things you can do: stop or pivot, but not kind of continue and fudge and continue and fudge and be worried about things. So that discipline comes with data.
Very well said, Sam. Very well said. So we've got just a few minutes left. I don't know if you have any additional remarks you'd like to get in, but I was going to give the audience a chance to ask you some questions as well.
No, let's open it up. Yeah.
Floor is open. Does anyone have any questions? I think that was a 2-finger. Homer Moyer, please.
All of the creative thinking and innovation is terrific, just to get us thinking creatively. As I listen to people-centered justice, it seems to me that fits very well in some rule of law context and not so well in some rule of law context, where individuals are customers or consumers of the justice system. That resonates. If you have an individual trying to protect a right or to achieve a redress or resolve a civil conflict, you can easily see how focusing on the needs side of that makes sense. There are other big parts of the rule of law where it's not the people directly involved. The question is which people. If you're looking at two big rule of law areas, criminal law and official corruption, it's not the people involved. They're not customers. They're not consumers. But it is the observers and beneficiaries in the general public that react to the rule of law in terms of how well those areas are functioning. And I'm not sure what the question is, whether you violently disagree with that or not, but it seems to me that the phrase fits much better in some contexts than others. And people focus justice in dealing with official corruption. It's not the people who are involved in it or who are trying to deal with it, but it's the broader public that's making rule of law judgments. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think it's a very good comment to make. And maybe important also, it helps me to clarify something. I mean, for me, people-centered justice does not mean do what the people like at all. People-centered justice just means that you build a justice system around the outcomes that you want to produce. And we say quickly for the people you want to produce it for, but the people also includes the civil servants that run it or the judges that run it. So one of the exercises that we've, been piloting and testing and trying, to get better at is, can you define for each different procedure, whether it is a criminal procedure or a land procedure or whatever, what are the outcomes you want to produce at the end of the procedure for whom? Start with that. So in the case of a criminal situation, we did it with, in the, yes, I would say smaller criminal area, in the smaller crimes in the Netherlands. If, for example, the case of somebody who was on his WhatsApp in the car and killed a child while driving. So for those kind of cases, what is the kind of outcome that you want? Okay, do you want to hang them? Probably not. You definitely want to punish. You want to set an example, but you want to help the family of the dead child move on in some shape or form. You probably at one stage would like the person who did it to also be allowed to move on, but there's also has to be punishment. You can work those things out. And that, I think, is the core of people-centered justice, that you go back to the outcomes that you want to produce. You bring the different stakeholders in the room about the outcomes, and the outcomes then help you also redefine the process you need to get to the outcomes. Because a lot of the procedures we now have are, we've heard that quite often. The law is often the problem. I don't know, this is not something I'm saying, but I hear a lot. And that's because the law was designed for a particular outcome, but that's not the outcome you really want. So I totally agree with you. But I think this outcome-based approach could work in any area. I've even, with a couple of people, tried it out on the tribunals, the international criminal tribunals and you don't get much more criminal law than that. But there too, if you have somebody who's, if you have cases of mass atrocities, what are the outcomes you would like that tribunal and the system around it to produce? And then what kind of procedures do you need to do that, and et cetera, et cetera.
I might add to your great question there, Helmer. I think when you're dealing with something like corruption, empowering the people to be engaged is a challenge. There are some, examples, I would say, like the False Claims Act in the United States, that do empower people who witness corruption to try to take action. And I think there's a lot of room for additional creativity in this space. But there are some examples there, I think. But I understand what you're talking about is just how do we get our mind around empowering people in this situation where the state is implicated in some of the problems. Other questions? Mary Margaret.
Mentioning the enabling environments, when we think about the importance of that and the complexity, how have you seen in your experience prioritization or a sequencing or a parallel action in terms of all of the factors that interplay in the enabling environments?
Oof. That's a really good question. We're starting to figure out in some of our projects what plays, what kind of issues play a role. And at least in our own, in the practices, we're trying to put those things into the methodologies that we use. But one of the questions issues we have also, within our own team is that, there's some things but some things also come down to having the right people in the room with the right competences and the right gut feeling to make things happen. There's only so much you can methodologize, if that's a word. So I suppose one of the things, but that's maybe a slight bias from me, but one of the things that I've certainly learned in these stakeholder dialogues that we do is that we as lawyers are also very cognitive. And there's also, in the enabling environment, there also has to be the heart and the soul, just connecting people and letting them talk about the challenges that they face and how difficult it is to create a safe space for a minister and a chief prosecutor, just to say, it's really, really hard. It's really, really tough, and sometimes things don't work. We've got some examples of these stakeholder dialogues on, which result in WhatsApp groups where people continue to exchange, and there's a high level of trust that is then created. And that trust is usually, I think that's important, again, around a why. So maybe that's one of the first things that you align, and the enabling environment is for a why. And part of the enabling environment is a clear why. We're all in it for this. And from there, a lot flows. So yeah, it's not a mathematical formula, but we do know, I think, also from other areas, what are the kind of things that matter. And I've mentioned a few. Yeah.
I would also just throw in as a footnote, Mary Margaret, that I think most of us who've been in the rule of law field for a while know how hard it is to just get those people to sit at the table together. I can remember being chastised to have a training where judges were sitting with private lawyers because we're not private lawyers, we're judges, or prosecutors sitting with private lawyers. And it's just, there are, little micro cultures within the legal system that sort of close ranks and protect one another. So what Sam's alluding to is sort of that first step is just breaking down some of those barriers and getting people to the table. Mr. Giswold.
I want to pick up on essentially something the dialogue with Homer was alluding to and Mary Margaret's question about sequencing. Sam, you mentioned that we want to strive toward a world where we've got essentially the equivalent of medical protocols, practices that have been proven, tested, outcome-oriented, data-driven. But at the same time, across the development world, we see the importance of working with the grain, of finding the best fit, not the best practice. And I wonder if you could explore or comment on the tension between those two, and to what extent your point about prior rule of law practice being sort of a graveyard of pilot programs, if we get into, because we're still going to have pilot programs.
Yes.
We're going to have to experiment, and we're going to have a much tighter circle of, or feedback loop of trying to figure out what works here. How do we move from that chaos into something that is more sort of aligning and sharing, like your WhatsApp groups, the beginnings of protocols, and the license, not in the legal sense, to fit them to your jurisdiction?
Wow.
This is not an easy crowd.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. Okay, let me start by saying I don't think we've figured that one out completely. That's the first thing. And you know, in our 3-year strategy now, 4-year strategy, sorry, at HiiL, we've basically said, let's try and create turning points towards people-centered justice in a number of countries, or even if it isn't in the country itself, but on a particular area in a particular country, then at least we can show that it could work, and then others will join and will join the crowd, and that'll help the wave forward, which already has a degree of iteration built into it. I think it'll well, I guess more chaos than we have now is difficult. So, but our experience is that if you bring together good people and you really take time and you allow also for failure, you allow also for times when it isn't working, you kind of move in that right direction. And that's why I really believe that people-centered justice or this way of working has gone from what is it to what you know, to let's do it. And I'll give you one extreme example. We worked with a group of stakeholders from Syria, where we had, you know, people who were closer to the government, never people from government, but judges working in that system and judges from the other side and anything in between, and businesses or whatever. And we worked with them for 2 years to define, you know, outcome-based goals for the most pressing justice problems that they have there. That project has gone like this. We started out at a time when we thought President Assad would go, and of course he didn't. And we're now all of a sudden, you know, have a lot of interest also from donors to reignite it on a number of things. So it also takes patience. Just keep doing those things and keep being rigorous about the data. Keep being rigorous about, you know, asking the critical question: is what you're doing somehow evidence-based? Can you relate it to what's happening? And of course, evidence-based practice doesn't mean a cookie-cutter approach at all. No, because the people that you're working with are in the room, so they can, you know, they can help change it. You can, as part of the process, they adapt the best practices. And that's maybe a challenge with all of this, that, you know, on the one hand, we lawyers, it's maybe something I also learned, we lawyers have been, you know, taught to look at the specific case. We're case thinkers. We're not system thinkers. We haven't been, you know, we don't have the mindset for that. So that's maybe also something that we need to learn how to do. And maybe a last thought that I would share is that you know, coming back to the enabling environment, I'm starting to think, you know, if somehow we could coalesce, if we have the data, the evidence-based practice, the innovation, and the enabling environment, if we kind of agree those are the key things we need to integrate in every program, then what we should be saying to each other is anything that doesn't comply with that, we're not going to do. Simple. We have to be strict about this if this is kind of what we think makes sense. So then let's do that. And I'm, you know, starting to challenge donors as well. So why are you funding this? Is it evidence-based? Is it data-driven? And secondly, to see if we could organize a little better the funding mechanisms that are needed. And for that, I'm also involved in the World Wildlife Fund. And one of the things I see there is that, you know, if a government or a big philanthropist or a foundation wants to fund something in climate change, it's very easy. We can just go, these are the kind of 3, 4, 5 things you should be funding, and they work. we haven't reached that stage, I think, in the justice sector yet. But there's a couple of things that I think are starting to emerge. Is one, I call that government catalytic funding. So this is what I'm saying. You know, as a Chief Justice or a Minister of Justice, you need to keep your mediocre system going. You can't stop that. But you need to be able to free out maybe 20% of your workforce to start working on innovation. That is what I call catalytic funding. That could come from the national budget. I'm going to speak to people at the World Bank after this, this conference, and this is one of the points I'm making to them. Create room for this. Telling donors, that's what you should be funding. Catalytic funding that allows a Minister of Justice or anybody who's running a system to basically free up 20% of your people, 25% of your people, do some R&D, and think about new things, think about data systems, think about blah, blah, blah. The second area is innovation funding. So once you know, new ideas come out, they could come from the government, they could come from the private sector. You need funding to scale them up. You need funding to help them going. We've created an Innovating Justice Fund ourselves with the help of the Dutch government. We're trying to scale that up. That's one mechanism, but there could be others. But you need to have, there's at the moment no funding to scale up innovations. Goes to your question, Scott. That would be the second thing we kind of need to coalesce around. And the third one, I think it also kind of exists already, is you'll always need money for grassroots help. And we've got the Legal Empowerment Fund that Namati runs. You know, that's something you could also organize nationally. And so if you have catalytic funding, you have innovation funding, and you have grassroots funding, and this needs a lot more thought, but maybe as a field, we could start developing those things, and then you could start saying to donors, and also to national taxpayers and treasury secretaries, this is, you know, these are the funding categories with which we're going to make this transformation based on these pillars. And then you have a story as a field.
Very well said. And I think I'm mindful of the time. I know Sam's got to be moving on. I want to thank you, Sam, as one of the founding fathers of PCJ, for letting us rip you halfway around the world. You were busy somewhere else, but you worked this into your schedule, and it's much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
I would also like to thank George Washington University, all of our panelists who were fantastic, and you as participants, and you online who are still there. We really appreciate this. This is the beginning of a very important conversation, and we look forward to continuing it with all of you. So thank you again for your time and attention.